They called her the she-wolf of Wanstead. They whispered her name behind velvet fans and heavy doors.
They called her the she-wolf of Wanstead. They whispered her name behind velvet fans and heavy doors, with the same venom they reserved for traitors and queens who fell from grace. But Lettice Knollys was not a traitor, not to her crown, not to her kin, not even to the queen she once called cousin and friend. What she defied was something far more dangerous. She defied the throne's jealousy. She married the man the Queen of England never could, and for that single, irreparable act, she was erased, not in ink, not in law, but in presence, banished from court, banished from memory, but never banished from history. Her story begins not in scandal, but in blood, the blue kind that runs tangled through Tudor veins. Born in the year 1532 to Sir Francis Knollys and Catherine Carey, Lettice carried the weight of legacy in her very name. Through her mother, she was a grandniece of Anne Boleyn, which made her a blood relative of Elizabeth Tudor, daughter of Henry VIII, and the same Anne who had died beneath a French sword. From childhood, Lettice was not just nobility, she was royal adjacent, woven into the very fabric of the emerging Elizabethan age. Her youth was shaped by exile and faith, her Protestant parents fleeing the Marian persecutions to raise their children in safety. But when Elizabeth rose to the throne in the year 1558, the Knollys family returned. Rewarded for their loyalty and belief, Sir Francis became vice-chamberlain. Lady Catherine became a senior lady of the bedchamber. And Lettice, radiant and sharp-tongued, entered the royal court as a maid of honor. It was there, among tapestries and secrets, that she first encountered Robert Dudley, the man whose name would follow her like a curse for the next 6 decades. She was 17 when she married her first husband, Walter Devereux, Viscount Hereford, who would later be named Earl of Essex. The match was appropriate. The children came quickly, and for a time, Lettice lived the role expected of her noble wife, mother, court beauty. But as her husband went to Ireland on military ventures, as ambition drew him further from home and danger crept closer, another man came into her orbit more fully, Robert Dudley, the Queen's favorite, the man with whom Elizabeth was said to be married in all but name. And so began the most dangerous entanglement of Lettice's life. What happened next depends on who tells the tale. Some say Lettice seduced him. Some say he pursued her in revenge against the Queen's refusals. Some claim she was pregnant before the wedding. Others insist she was already a widow in all but name. What is known is this: in the year 1576, Walter Devereux died suddenly in Dublin, his insides torn by dysentery or poison. If you believe the darker accounts, and barely 2 years later, in the quiet, curtained halls of Wanstead House, Lettice Knollys and Robert Dudley were married in secret. It was a marriage made not in heaven, but in defiance. Dudley knew what he risked. Elizabeth had never allowed him to wed, even after her own suitors had come and gone. Even after his name had been cleared of his first wife's suspicious death, she had claimed him, even if she had never officially taken him. So when news of the wedding broke not through a confession, but through the lips of a French ambassador who had heard court whispers, the Queen's fury was volcanic. Elizabeth screamed, wept, and swore never to look upon Lettice Knollys again. And she kept her word. From that day forward, Lettice became a ghost in the land she once ruled with her presence. Banished from court, banished from ceremony, banished from the glow of her cousin's golden court, she was branded the she-wolf, the Dudley whore, the thief of Elizabeth's crownless husband. She could not show her face at court. And, if she dared walk in London, she did so under watchful, hateful eyes. But Lettice did not disappear. She returned to Oxfordshire. She bore Dudley a son, young Robert, Lord Denbigh, only to lose him to illness at a tender age. She grieved in silence, as her husband drifted between court favor and royal frost, when Dudley died suddenly in the year 1588, leaving behind debts of over £50,000. Lettice was not only a widow but the inheritor of a financial disaster. Still, she did not crumble. Instead, she remarried another scandal, this time to Sir Christopher Blount, a man younger than her, a Catholic soldier, and once a companion of her late husband. The court recoiled again. But Lettice, now seasoned by pain and sharpened by experience, no longer sought approval. She sought peace. And for a time, she found it. But tragedy would find her once more. Her second son, Walter, died in France. Her eldest, Robert Dudley, the second Earl of Essex, rose high as the Queen's new favorite, only to fall farther than any before him. His rebellion, trial, and execution in the year 1601 broke what remained of Lettice's heart. She lost not only her child, but her husband Christopher, who was executed as part of the plot, alone, aging, and once again, buried beneath shame, not her own. Lettice faded into the quiet halls of Drayton Bassett, yet even there, she remained formidable. She battled in court to protect her remaining wealth. She sued the illegitimate son of Robert Dudley to preserve her jointure rights to Kenilworth Castle. She raised grandchildren, counseled wayward girls, and walked daily into her 90th year. When she died on Christmas Day in the year 1634, she had outlived her enemies, her lovers, her queen, and even her name's dishonor. But what remains is not just the scandal, nor just the shame. What remains is the spine of a woman who dared to love the man the Queen could not. A woman who was cast out and kept walking. A woman who wore the title Countess of Leicester, not as a crown, but as a shield. This was Lettice Knollys, and in the shadow of Elizabeth's golden age, hers is the story they tried to forget, and we are about to remember. The walls of Wanstead Hall held their breath that morning, as if the ancient timbers themselves understood the weight of what was about to happen. Outside, the garden lay still under a thin layer of mist, and the gravel paths bore no sound. The courtiers had not yet arrived. The Queen's men were far away, and for once in her life, Lettice Knollys felt what she had never dared to feel before, a kind of dangerous peace. She was about to become a wife again, not just any wife, and not just any man. She was to wed Robert Dudley, the man who had danced with power for more than 20 years, the man the Queen had loved but never taken, and the man whose name had been etched into every scandal, whisper, and sonnet, since the first day of Elizabeth's reign. But on that morning in the year 1578, Lettice stood in a simple gown, pale and unadorned, with no crown, no trumpet, no grand processional. There were no courtiers lining the halls, no ambassadors waiting in velvet chairs, no poets to immortalize the moment. Instead, there were only a few. Her father, Sir Francis Knollys, solemn and silent. Her brother, supportive yet wary, and a handful of Leicester's most trusted men. Robert Dudley himself stood across from her, his face uncharacteristically soft, his usual mask of confidence replaced with something that looked almost like fear. The ceremony was whispered, the vows spoken low, and when the words were finally said, when Lettice became in secret and in silence, the Countess of Leicester, the air in the room shifted, as if the world itself had turned a corner from which there was no returning. The moment they signed the marriage papers, they became enemies of the Queen. They both knew it. Lettice had spent enough years in court to understand how Elizabeth's heart worked, how it beat, not with love, but with control. Elizabeth had never forgiven betrayal, especially not from a woman, and especially not from a woman whose blood ran as close to hers as Lettice's did. She would not forgive this wedding. She would not forgive that Dudley had chosen another. And most of all, she would not forgive that Lettice had dared to take the one man Elizabeth had loved, even if she had never been able to claim him. And so the wedding that should have been a beginning was, instead, the start of a long and bitter exile. At first, they tried to keep it hidden. Leicester demanded secrecy, fearing Elizabeth's wrath with every letter he sent. He asked those present at the wedding to keep silent. But secrets, as they always do in England, slipped through cracks. And when the French ambassador got wind of the ceremony, only 2 months later, the inevitable happened. The Queen found out, and her rage was not theatrical. It was not political. It was personal. She banished Lettice from court immediately, without appeal, without audience, without a chance to explain. One day Lettice walked the glittering halls of Whitehall as family. The next, she was poison. They said Elizabeth screamed when she learned the truth, that she smashed a mirror with her bare hands, that she cursed both names, Knollys and Dudley, in front of her ladies, swearing that she would never lay eyes on either of them again. But Elizabeth could not banish Leicester, not completely. He was too valuable, too beloved by the people, too essential to the balance of the court, so she tolerated him, let him return, but with icy distance and a sharp, cold eye. But Lettice would never be allowed back. Lettice understood this. She did not try to beg for mercy. She left London quietly, retreating to the countryside, where she would spend the next years in a kind of invisible nobility, still titled, still wealthy, still known, but never seen where it mattered. She took the name Countess of Essex again in public, as if to erase the fire her second marriage had started. But even that could not save her. The Queen's hatred was enduring, and yet, even in banishment, Lettice was not broken. She managed her estate. She kept her servants paid. She tended to her children. She stayed informed through letters and friends. And though the court might have tried to forget her, she remained a quiet force. A woman who had not disappeared, only stepped into the shadowed margins. But shadows do not guarantee safety. And the years that followed would offer Lettice no comfort. In the year 1584, tragedy struck their household. Robert, Lord Denbigh, the only child born from her marriage with Dudley, fell ill and died before reaching his 6th birthday. He had been a lively boy, full of promise, the last hope of the Dudley name. His loss shattered them. Leicester, devastated, withdrew from court. He begged Elizabeth to understand, to allow him the dignity of mourning. But her heart, hardened by betrayal, had had no room for sympathy. That same year, Lettice found herself again the target of rumor. Whispers flew that she planned to follow her husband to the Netherlands, that she would command a kind of power abroad that had been denied her at home. But the rumors were false. Her place was in England, not in court, but not in disgrace either. She stayed behind, quietly, waiting for a moment that would never come. In the year 1588, the Spanish Armada loomed, and England braced for war. Leicester, ever loyal to his queen, despite their silent rift, was sent to command forces in the Midlands. He departed with a heavy heart and a sick body. Only weeks later, he collapsed at Cornbury Park and died. Lettice received the news like a widow twice over. She had lost her first husband to illness, and now her second to exhaustion and regret. She traveled to Warwick, where his body would be laid to rest in the Beauchamp Chapel. She stood beside his casket, her face unreadable, her gown simple, her grief quiet. Around her stood those who still bore her name in contempt, those who whispered that she had brought about his ruin. But Lettice said nothing. She only placed her hand upon the wood and murmured a final farewell. Now truly alone, she returned to her estate. But her trials had only begun. The debts Leicester left behind were staggering £50,000, and enough to drown any noble house. His will did not protect her. His lands were disputed. His illegitimate son, Robert Dudley, the younger, it would one day come for what he believed was his birthright. Lettice barely recovered from her grief. I found herself in court again, not royal court, but the court of law. But even in mourning, Lettice moved with fire. She would fight for what was hers. She would defend her name. She would not let herself be erased. Years would pass. The world would change. But the secret wedding at Wanstead would remain the turning point, the moment that redefined her. She had loved boldly, perhaps foolishly. She had risked everything, and she had paid the price. Yet even in exile, even in widowhood, Lettice Knollys never lost her spine. And in the quiet country halls of Drayton Bassett, where tapestries hung low and hearths burned slow, her story was told not in whispers, but in the slow, steady rhythm of survival. She had defied the queen. She had become the wife the virgin queen could never be. And though history tried to bury her in scandal, she endured. Because sometimes the women history fears the most are the ones who simply refuse to disappear. The year was 1588. And England's skies were clouded not only with the threat of Spanish sails, but with the mourning veil of a widow no one wanted to see. Lettice Knollys stood alone again. The man she had defied a queen to marry now lay buried beneath the stone floor of the Beauchamp Chapel. Robert Dudley, the glittering Earl of Leicester, the queen's favorite, the object of Lettice's scandal and secret vows, was dead. And in his place remained only debts, whispers, and a widow too proud to weep where they could see her. She returned to Drayton Bassett without ceremony. Her steps did not echo through palace corridors, and no trumpets welcomed her home. In the country stillness, among worn books and quiet servants, she began once more to stitch her life back together. Yet this time, it was not just her own name she fought to protect, for she still had a son, and in him, all the shattered threads of her past seemed to twist together into something that might be mended. He was Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, the child of her first marriage, and the last light flickering in a house long threatened by shadow. He was young, barely 30, and burning with ambition. Tall, charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and impetuous. Her sweet Robin had inherited not only his father's title, but also his mother's hunger for recognition. The queen had taken a liking to him in earlier years, calling him to court, smiling upon him as she once smiled upon Dudley. Some said she even loved him, in her strange, possessive way. But Elizabeth's affections were always laced with conditions, and her approval could vanish faster than a summer wind. Essex had watched the way Elizabeth had punished Lettice, not with sword or scaffold, but with something colder: silence. He knew the price of stepping too far outside the Queen's favor. He had grown up in the shadow of his mother's disgrace. And yet, for all his brilliance, for all his promises to rise and redeem the family name, he too would misstep. And when he fell, he would fall harder than any man before him. At first, his star rose high. He led troops in the Netherlands and returned a war hero. He spoke boldly in court. He gained followers. He became, for a brief moment, the new favorite, a son in the Queen's court where his mother had become a ghost. But Lettice, watching from the edge of that world, I knew how brittle that crown could be. She had seen what it had done to Dudley. She had lived what it meant to be too close to Elizabeth's heart. And she saw the signs again, the same restlessness, the same need to impress, the same fatal hunger for more. She wrote to her son often. Her letters were careful, laced with advice. She warned him not to push too hard, not to trust the court's smiles. But Essex was not made for caution. He had inherited his mother's pride and his father's recklessness. In the year 1591, he clashed with the Queen over Ireland. She wanted obedience. He offered strategy. She wanted submission. He offered flair. In court, his words turned sharp. In private, he sulked. Elizabeth, never one to be challenged, began to turn. Then came the duel of wills that would end them both. Essex was sent to Ireland with a massive army and instructions to crush the rebellion. But instead of glory, he found failure, exhaustion, and betrayal. He disobeyed orders. He made a truce with the rebels, and worst of all, unforgivably, he returned to England without permission. He burst into the Queen's chamber before she was properly dressed, saw her barefaced and furious, and shattered the fragile dance of power between them. She never forgave him. He was arrested, stripped of his offices, banished from court, and once again, Lettice watched as the Queen destroyed the man she once cherished. But this time, it was her son. Lettice's heart broke anew. She had outlived one husband, then another. She had buried her youngest child. She had endured scandal, exile, and silence. But the thought of losing her son, her sweet Robin, was different. He had been the last thing untouched by the Queen's wrath. And now, even that thread was unraveling. She traveled to London. Though her presence in the capital stirred unease, people remembered her face. Even if they dared not speak her name aloud, she petitioned quietly, using old friends and former allies, begging for her son's pardon. But Elizabeth would not hear her. The Queen had closed the door years ago, and no knock from Lettice Knollys would ever make it open again. And then came the final blow. In the early months of the year, 1601, Essex launched a rebellion. Misguided, desperate, reckless. He believed he could storm London, rally support, force the Queen to reinstate him. But no one came. The gates did not open. The crowds did not rise. The Queen did not bend. He was arrested, tried, condemned. Lettice received the news like a thunderclap in an empty room. No one dared look her in the eye when they told her she had tried everything. Letters, prayers, silence, rage. But nothing could turn back the Queen's vengeance. On the morning of his execution, she sat alone, hands trembling, breath shallow. As the last of her children was led to the scaffold, he died with dignity. He asked for forgiveness, and then he was gone. They said Lettice did not cry that day, but something inside her broke forever. as if fate were not yet done with her. Sir Christopher Blount, her third husband, the man who had stood beside her after Dudley's death, the man younger than she, whom society never approved, was also executed in the aftermath of the failed uprising. In a matter of weeks, Lettice lost not only her son but her husband. Her household emptied. Her rooms fell silent, and yet she remained. She returned once more to Drayton Bassett, not as the Countess of Essex, not as the widow of Leicester, not even as the mother of a traitor. She returned simply as Lettice, a woman who had lived too long, lost too much, and still refused to vanish. In those years, she found solace in odd places, in books, in quiet walks, in the companionship of Mary Cresswell, a young woman torn between her faith and her future, whom Lettice guided away from the cloister and toward a life of Protestant purpose. Theirs was not a loud story, not a courtly one, but in that bond, Lettice found something court had never offered her: peace. She aged, but never withered, even into her 80s. She walked every day. She wrote letters with a clear hand. Her wit remained sharp. She kept the memory of her family alive, not through tears, but through will. She made certain that her grandson, the third Earl of Essex, would inherit the title his father had lost. She watched as King James ascended the throne in 1603, and with him came a pardon for the past. The Queen was gone. The doors were unlocked, but Lettice never asked to return, because some wounds do not heal, and some silences, encendured, become part of who you are. Her name would never again be spoken at court with honor, but it was never erased. And when she died, on Christmas Day of the year 1634, she did not die in disgrace. She died as she had lived, stubborn, silent, and surrounded by the echo of everything she had survived. It would have been easier, perhaps even merciful, if after the execution of her son and the death of her third husband, Lettice Knollys had simply faded away, if she had grown quiet, retreated from the world, and let her name dissolve like dust into the corners of Drayton Bassett. But Lettice had never been that kind of woman. There was iron in her breath, and bone beneath hair, dignity. The world may have taken her children, her titles, her court, and her peace, but it would not take what was left: her name, her property, and the truth she alone had carried for decades. The world around her was changing. Elizabeth Tudor, the woman who had once exiled Lettice with a single breath, was dead. The Queen had passed in the spring of the year 1603. After more than 4 decades on the throne, her kingdom left uncertain, her enemies quiet, her favorites mostly gone. Lettice had outlived her. That alone was a strange triumph, quiet, uncelebrated, but sweet in its own private way. For over 25 years, she had lived in the shadow of Elizabeth's hatred, stripped of position, déniée d'entrance, forbidden even to walk the corridors of Whitehall. But now, the woman who had burned her with silence was gone, and with her passing came a subtle shift, a loosening of old knots. King James of Scotland, newly crowned as James I of England, arrived with his own loyalties, his own advisors, his own appetite for fresh alliances. He had never known Lettice, had never heard her spoken of with the same venom that Elizabeth had used. To him, she was simply a dowager countess, old now, but still connected to great names: Dudley, Devereux, Knollys. In his first acts as sovereign, he restored her grandson, Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex, to the family's title and lands. That alone was a balm to a woman whose heart still bled. The name her son had carried to the scaffold was raised up again, given back its power, its place, its future. Lettice had lived to see that redemption. But peace would not follow easily, because even in her later years, scandal clung to her. It was not new scandal, she had buried most of that long ago, but the echoes of the old ones. Chief among them was the name Robert Dudley, not her dead husband, but the man who claimed to be his illegitimate son. For years, this younger Robert had stalked the fringes of nobility, quietly asserting that he had been born of Leicester and Lady Douglas Sheffield, long before Lettice had married the Earl. At first, few took him seriously, but then came Leicester's will, and with it, complications. Before his death, the Earl had left the prized Kenilworth Castle not to Lettice, but to this disputed son, a man he had acknowledged in private, but never legitimized in law. When the Earl died, and Lettice began settling his debts and affairs, she found that her claim to certain lands, including Kenilworth, was threatened. The young Robert Dudley, styling himself as the rightful heir, began to push more openly, challenging her rights and questioning the very legality of her marriage, and that was the line Lettice Knollys would not allow him to cross. She may have tolerated exile, she may have borne slander, but to have her marriage questioned, to have some upstart bastard child, suggests that her union with Robert Dudley had been invalid, that her son had been illegitimate, that her widowhood was a lie that was something she could not forgive. And so, well into her 70s, Lettice went to war. The courtroom was not the battlefield of a young woman. It was a place of patience, documentation, lineage, and strategy. But Lettice was no stranger to survival. With the support of Sir Robert Sidney, who, as the legitimate heir to the Earl of Warwick, also had reason to resent the younger Dudley's claims, she launched a legal complaint in the formidable Star Chamber. The goal was not just to preserve land or titles, it was to erase the stain of defamation, to silence the whispers that had haunted her house since the day she said her secret vows at Wanstead Hall. Testimonies were gathered, letters summoned, past servants questioned, witnesses came forward who had seen Leicester acknowledge the younger Robert, but also many who attested to the validity of his marriage with Lettice. Documents were examined for signs of tampering, and through it all, Lettice remained focused, determined not to let the shadow of this man ruin what little peace remained in her twilight years. In the end, the scales tipped in her favor. The Star Chamber recognized the ambiguity of the younger Dudley's claims and took steps to suppress further attempts at defamation. The Kenilworth property remained a point of contest, but Lettice had defended the name of her marriage, her son, and her legacy. She had won not a fortune, but something far more precious, the right to be remembered as the rightful wife of the Earl of Leicester. Not his mistake, but victory came at a cost. The legal battles, the grief, the years of resistance, they had worn her down. Her wealth was no longer vast. Much of her jewelry had been lost or sold to pay off debts, some squandered by her late husband Christopher Blount in his efforts to settle Leicester's obligations. Her letters from this period speak not of pride, but of weariness. Still, there was no bitterness in them, only the quiet persistence of a woman who had learned to live without praise. At Drayton Bassett, she carved out a final life, not grand, not celebrated, but filled with the slow rhythms of country days. Her grandchildren visited, her daughters, Penelope and Dorothy, remained loyal, their own lives marked by the same struggles of status, marriage, and scandal. Lettice guided them as she could, her advice forged from decades of survival, and in her presence, the younger Earl of Essex, her grandson, found something resembling steadiness, a grandmother who had known both the highest circles of power and the coldest depths of disgrace. In her walks through the fields, she carried a cane, but her step remained firm. Her hair had long since turned silver, but her eyes clear, sharp, knowing missed nothing. The servants still addressed her with deference, not out of fear, but respect. She wrote letters with a steady hand, her signature still proud: Lettice, Countess of Leicester. She never remarried. She did not return to court, even after Elizabeth's death. Even when the halls of Whitehall might have opened to her once more, she chose not to go. Some wounds, she understood, were not meant to be reopened. And some places, no matter how gilded, were not worth revisiting. What she had chosen instead was a quieter kind of nobility, one made not of titles or dances, but of endurance. Hers was a house where grief had lived for many years, but also memory and strength, and an almost royal solitude. She was the woman who had once been called a thief of the Queen's man, the scandal of the court, the she-wolf of Wanstead. But in the end, she had become something else entirely, a survivor of a brutal age, a mother who had outlived her children, a widow who had carried the debts of 2 husbands, and a name that refused to vanish. When visitors came, they were struck not by the grandeur of her house, but by its silence. Portraits lined the walls of Dudley, of Devereux, of children long gone, and yet there was no mourning in their gaze. Only the faint trace of something deeper, memory, earned and endured. Her life was not a tragedy. It was a long reckoning, and it was not yet over. There is a certain cruelty in paper. It does not bleed. It does not mourn, and it never weeps for the people it ruins. It lies flat and silent, and yet it can undo everything a person has lived for. In the autumn of her years, Lettice Knollys came to understand this cruelty in full. When a single piece of parchment, old, signed, and folded in the iron will of a man, long buried, rose from the dust to haunt her peace. It had been decades since Robert Dudley, her second husband, the Earl of Leicester, had died. Time had taken many things from her since then: her youth, her children, and her place at court, but not her memory, and not her truth. She had kept her dignity intact through exile, disgrace, and scandal. She had outlived Elizabeth Tudor, outlived 2 husbands and 4 children, and watched the monarchy change hands with barely a word. But now, in her 80s, her name once again found its way into court papers, not because of new sins, but because of old wounds reopened. The problem, as always, was Kenilworth. That vast, half-ruined castle in Warwickshire had once been the pride of her husband's estates. It was there that Dudley had tried, in vain, to impress the Queen with theatrical displays, banquets, and fireworks, hoping she might one day agree to be his wife. It was there that Lettice herself had walked the gardens as mistress after their secret wedding, and it was there, long after Dudley's death, that the seeds of a bitter inheritance dispute had taken root. The will, the document Dudley had drawn up before his death in the year 1588, did not name Lettice as heir to Kenilworth Castle. Instead, it granted the estate to a man who had long lingered in the margins of the Dudley legacy, Robert Dudley, the younger, the Earl's illegitimate son, a man born not of marriage, but of scandal, and whose very existence had always unsettled the fragile truth Lettice had built around her life. She had tolerated the rumors in earlier years. She had even, with some grace, ignored the boy's attempts to claim the Dudley name in public. But when the will surfaced, and when it was discovered that the younger Dudley had been left not only property but status, and that the king himself, James I, was now willing to acknowledge him, Lettice's silence ended. This was not about land anymore. It was about history. Her history, if Leicester had left Kenilworth to this other Robert. Did it mean he had doubted the legality of his marriage to Lettice? Did it mean he had harbored regrets? Worse, did it mean that the son she and Leicester had buried, little Robert, Lord Denbigh, had not been his true heir at all? The implications spread like ink across everything she had once believed was safe. And so, though her body was frailer now, and her days slower, Lettice prepared for another fight. Not with swords, not with scandal, but with lawyers, with affidavits, with the kind of cold-blooded resolve only age and grief can sharpen. She took the matter to the Star Chamber, England's High Court of Equity, and filed a formal complaint against Robert Dudley the Younger. She did not stand alone. Sir Robert Sidney, her ally and kinsman, who also had claims upon the Dudley legacy through the Earl of Warwick, joined her efforts. He had his own reasons, pride, perhaps, or property, but he, too, was offended by the idea that an illegitimate son could inherit over the rightful countess. Together, they prepared a case that reached back decades through letters, witness accounts, household records, even family conversations, anything that could support her truth. The arguments were not gentle. Dudley, the Younger's side, insisted that he had been acknowledged, if not formally legitimized. They presented letters, tokens, conversations with the Earl himself. They painted a picture of a man long denied his place, and there was some sympathy in that. Even Lettice, in quieter moments, may have felt the faint echo of pity for a man who had always been told he was a shadow. But sympathy could not replace truth. She countered with evidence of her marriage, the secrecy of Wanstead, the presence of her father and brother at the wedding, the witnesses who had sworn to it. She brought forth records of Lord Denbigh's baptism, letters from Dudley, proofs of their shared estate. She presented a legacy, not of rumor, but of fact. And, more than that, she presented herself. By this time, Lettice was an old woman. Her hair had whitened. Her voice had softened, but her eyes were still clear. Her words sharp. Her memory precise. She knew what had been done to her. She knew how close she had come to being forgotten, and she knew what would happen if this man succeeded in writing her out of the past. The chamber weighed it all. And at last, a decision was reached. While the full extent of the ruling remains clouded in historical records, one truth emerged. The younger Dudley's claims would be muted. His evidence would be sealed, impounded, and suppressed. His story would not be allowed to stand above hers. Lettice had defended her marriage again. She had defended her title again. She had saved what remained of her legacy from the hands of a man she had never called family. But even in victory, there was no joy, because by then, almost everyone she had fought for was gone. Penelope, her beloved daughter, had died. Dorothy, her younger girl, followed soon after. Her grandson Robert, the third Earl of Essex, remained, and he visited often. Finding in her a strange comfort, he had grown into his title well. Unsteady where his father had been wild, careful where his grandfather had been reckless. But he, too, was marked by the past, by the weight of a name that had once been lifted high and then thrown to the mud. Lettice spoke little of the lawsuit in her final years. She had never cared for glory. What she wanted was silence, not the silence of exile, but the silence of dignity, of calm, of being left alone after a life that had never truly been her own. The seasons changed slowly at Drayton Bassett. The fires were kept low. The rooms smelled of ink and linen, and the world outside seemed farther away than ever. Visitors came, politely and rarely. They saw not the she-wolf of Wanstead, not the Countess of Essex, not even the widow of Leicester. They saw an old woman, sitting in a high-backed chair by the fire, writing letters in a hand that had not yet trembled. She had lost almost everything, but she had held on to her name, and that in the end was enough. The silence had stretched for so long. It no longer hurt. At first, it had seared like flame, the silence of banishment, of doors closed too firmly to knock again, of letters unanswered and halls unwalked. But over time, that silence became something else. It became her shelter, her shield, her companion. For 17 years, Lettice Knollys lived beneath the heavy curtain of the Queen's hatred. And when that Queen died, the silence did not lift. It merely changed shape. She had once stood at the center of power, cousin to a queen, daughter of a chamberlain, wife to a favorite, and yet, for all the names she had carried, Lady Essex, Countess of Leicester, the woman who married the Queen's man, the one name she could never again claim was welcome. Not in court, not in London, not in the eyes of Elizabeth Tudor, who had, with one furious breath, erased her from the palace and from the favor of a realm after the secret wedding at Wanstead Hall in the year 1578. And the storm that followed. Lettice had accepted her exile with the still grace of someone who had already survived too much to kneel. But that did not mean she did not miss what had been lost. She missed the court's music, not its flatteries or its politics, but its movement, its rhythm, its light. She missed the way life pulsed through its corridors, how she could walk through a door and see a dozen histories unfolding at once. But most of all, she missed being seen not as a scandal, not as a name on a letter, but as a presence, a woman among equals. That was what the Queen had taken from her, not wealth, not property, but her place in the world. Years passed. She buried her son. She stood in a courtroom to defend her name. She guided her grandchildren through a country growing older with her. And all the while, the Queen did not speak her name. 17 years passed, and Lettice was still banished. Not by law, but by something deeper, by the wound neither woman had ever dared touch. But then, in the winter of the year 1597, a rumor found its way into the quiet rooms of Drayton Bassett. They said the Queen was softening. It came not as a proclamation, but as a whisper spoken first by a cautious friend, then repeated by a cautious letter. Elizabeth, now, in her mid-60s, was growing weary. She was surrounded by memories, by ghosts, by fading faces that reminded her of all she had lost. Dudley was gone. Hatton was gone. Walsingham. Burghley. One by one. The old guard had passed. Even the rebellion of Essex, Lettice's son, had dulled from outrage into memory. The Queen was alone. And perhaps, the whispers said, she was ready to forgive. Lettice did not believe it. Not at first. She had lived too long with the knowledge of what Elizabeth's silence truly meant. But something stirred in her, not hope, not quite, something more cautious. a hunger not for position, but for peace, not for favor, but for closure, a breath of possibility that maybe, just once, before death, the door might open again, and the woman who had once been her cousin, her monarch, her rival, might see her not with anger, but with something softer. And so she prepared. The letter was brief, careful, modest in tone. It made no demands. It only suggested, quietly, that time had passed, that sorrow had passed, that perhaps, in the dust of what had been, a meeting might bring a kind of healing. She waited, and weeks later, not months, came a reply. The Queen would receive her. The journey to London was slow. Lettice no longer rode at a gallop. She was in her 60s now. Her hair silvered, her body aching in cold mornings, but her spine remained straight. Her mind clear. She traveled in winter, cloaked not only against the weather, but against memory. For the road to the palace was lined with ghosts of Dudley, of her son, of all the things that had passed since she had last been allowed to walk among the courtiers. When she arrived, it was not Whitehall. It was Richmond, a theatre palace, suited to an aging monarch and an even older grief. The meeting was arranged with discretion. No fanfare, no audience, just two women who had once stood at the center of a storm, now meeting in the quiet hush of twilight. And what passed between them has never been fully recorded. Some say they only nodded, that their eyes met, and that was all. Others say they spoke briefly, in strained tones, of the past, not its wounds, but its weight. And others, still, say that they did not speak at all, but that when Lettice entered the room, the Queen looked up from her chair, rose slowly, and kissed her once lightly upon the cheek. No titles, no forgiveness, no apology, but a kiss. It was the only one she would ever receive. After that meeting, Lettice did not stay in London. She did not ask for a place in court. She did not seek restoration. She returned to the countryside with quiet hands and a quiet heart. What had passed was enough. The Queen had seen her, not as an enemy, not as the she-wolf, not as the thief of Dudley's love, but as a woman, old, tired, and still standing. And that smile, that moment of silent recognition, meant everything. In the 7 years that followed, Lettice did not speak of the meeting often. She had no need to. It was not a story for servants or gossip. It was not a triumph. It was not a defeat. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she had been forced to write with her life. And when Elizabeth Tudor died, in the spring of the year 1603, Lettice Knollys did not rejoice. She did not mourn either. She only lit a candle. And she said nothing, because some griefs are too old for words, and some wounds do not bleed anymore. They only mark the skin like old ink, faded, but legible if you know where to look. In the years that followed, Lettice grew slower, her walks became shorter, her letters less frequent, but she remained herself. Her hair, once flame, now full silver. Her body bowed, but never broken. Her name is still clear in every document she signed: Lettice, Countess of Leicester. And though she had once been banished, once erased, once called a scandal and a danger, she had outlived them all. The Queen, the favorites, the lovers, the enemies. She had seen the age change, and she had remained. And in that, perhaps, there was peace. There are certain endings that do not arrive with thunder, or with swords, or with royal decrees. Some endings come slowly, softly, like a shadow lengthening over stone, barely noticed until it is everywhere. And for Queen Elizabeth, the shadow had begun long before her crown ever slipped. Lettice Knollys, now old and long removed from the world of palaces, I could feel it, not because of prophecy, not because of politics, but because a silence had settled over Chelsea, the kind of silence that often comes before the very last breath. It was the early spring of the year, 1603, and in the crumbling grace of Chelsea Manor, a once unbreakable woman was breaking. Elizabeth Tudor had been queen for more than 4 decades, had buried rivals, outlasted suitors, commanded fleets, and terrified kings. But now, and she sat alone in a room she would not leave, wrapped in layers of black velvet, refusing her food, refusing her bed, refusing to speak of what she surely knew was coming. Her counselors begged her to rest. Her doctors whispered of dropsy, of weariness, of melancholy, but those close to her knew the truth. It was not illness that had come for her. It was death, and she had no heir to whisper to, no son at her side, no husband to hold her hand, only the ghosts of men she had loved, but never touched. Robert Dudley, gone these 15 years, Walter Raleigh, imprisoned, and Robin Devereux, the young Earl of Essex, executed with her signature only 2 years before. And perhaps, in those final days, she thought of Lettice, the woman who had loved where she had only watched, the woman who had taken the one man Elizabeth had truly, madly, never let go. No one knows. No word of Lettice crossed the Queen's lips in those final hours, but Lettice Olger, hidden away in Drayton Bassett. Her body as fragile now as the old papers in her chests, had already begun her own silent farewell. For decades, she had lived in the Queen's shadow. And now, the shadow was falling at last. It began with 4 days. 4 days. In a quiet chamber of Chelsea, where the Queen finally allowed a will to be written. Not a grand scroll of riches, not a tapestry of generosity, but a brief, stubborn scrawl full of hesitations, vague appointments, and unclear intentions. Her lawyers urged her to name her successor, but she would not. Her voice, once a command that could freeze a man in his boots, was barely more than a breath. And so, her will was muddled, like her final months, scattered, defensive, uncertain. The courtiers who once danced for her began to make preparations. The locks on her chambers were quietly changed. The whispers turned louder. The Queen is dying. The Queen is dying. The Queen has died. It was the 24th day of March, in the year 1603, and the Tudor dynasty died with her. The news reached Lettice, slowly carried not by royal messenger, but by rumor, by cautious mention at her gates, by a letter bearing only a single sentence: the Queen is gone. James has been proclaimed. Lettice read it twice, then folded it once. She said nothing. She had known Elizabeth from childhood, had shared a family bloodline through Anne Boleyn, had walked the same halls, worn the same gowns, bowed before the same kings. They had both married Dudley, one in fantasy, the other in secret. They had both buried sons. They had both outlived too many men. But only one of them had died, Queen. And only one of them had died alone. For all the bitterness, all the exile, all the decades of silence, Lettice could not hate her in that final moment. What she felt was not victory, not relief, but a strange, aching recognition. 2 women, 2 survivors. And now, only one remained. In London, chaos unfolded quietly. The Scottish king, James VI of Scotland, was now James I of England. His court moved swiftly. He promised unity, promised a new beginning, promised favor to those who had served him in shadow. And one of the first things he did without ceremony, without argument, was restore the title and lands of the Essex line, the grandson of Lettice. Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex, was given back what had been taken from his father, the titles, the prestige, the name, and in doing so, King James erased the stain of rebellion. And Lettice, who had outlived them all, lived to see the Devereux name restored. It was a quiet triumph. No bells, no banquets. But her tears were real. And more than that, the king cancelled her debts, the debts left behind by Dudley, unpaid for decades, lingering like ghosts in ledgers and court records, all forgiven, all erased. After so many years of silence, Lettice finally heard the sound of mercy. But not all shadows vanished. For even as her name was restored, and her grandson reclaimed his place, another document stirred again, the will of Robert Dudley, the one she had already fought so hard to silence. In it, again, was the name Robert Dudley, the younger. Again, were the rights to Kenilworth. Again, the challenge to everything she had defended. And now, with Queen Elizabeth gone, and King James newly crowned, the younger Dudley saw opportunity. He appeared at court, made his claims, and whispered again that he was not merely the son of Robert Dudley, but the rightful heir. He claimed legitimacy. He claimed title. And in doing so, he once more tried to reduce Lettice to nothing but a forgotten wife, a scandal long buried. But Lettice did not flinch. She had fought this man before. She would fight him again. Supported once more by Sir Robert Sidney, who considered himself heir to the Warwick estate. She re-entered the fray. The battle moved again to the Star Chamber, now under new rule, but still a place where reputation could be won or shattered. She brought her records. She brought her witnesses. She brought the memory of a marriage fought for in whispers and tears. And again, the court ruled in her favor. The evidence was impounded. The younger Dudley's documents suppressed. The flame of his claims snuffed out, once and for all. And so, with the Queen dead and her enemies silenced, Lettice Knollys stood, as she had always stood, quiet, watchful, undefeated, now in her 80s. She did not travel far. Her world had grown smaller rooms lined with memories. A garden where she walked each morning with a servant's arm for balance. A chair by the fire where she read her letters and wrote her name. Still steady. Still sharp. Lettice, Countess of Leicester. Her children were gone. Her husbands long buried. Her queen now only a face in paintings. But Lettice endured. And in the shadows of Chelsea Manor, where Elizabeth had written her last words with a trembling hand, Lettice wrote nothing at all, because she did not need to. She had lived. She had survived. And history, no matter how the Queen had tried, had not forgotten her. By the time the last winter came, Lettice Knollys had stopped counting her years. Not because she had forgotten them. She remembered each one with the clarity of someone who had never been allowed to rest, but because they no longer frightened her. She had outlived everyone who once cursed her name. She had walked through courtrooms and gravesides and banishments. And now, in the soft silence of her estate at Drayton Bassett, she walked only between windows and fireplaces, Her world narrowed not by fear, but by peace. Outside, the year had turned cold again. The sky, even at noon, held the pale gray of late December. The trees, bare now, rattled gently in the wind, and the earth had frozen over in long veins of frost. Inside her manor, the fires burned low but steady, and the candles flickered along stone walls she had once paced as a young woman in black silk and defiance. That woman was gone now, but the name remained. Lettice, Countess of Leicester. She still signed her letters that way. Her hand, though slower, was steady. Her ink was dark. Her signature, a defiance in itself. After all these years, the banishment, the scandal, the whispers, she had never given it up. Her grandson, Robert Dudley, now the third Earl of Essex, often visited her in these last years. He came not as a nobleman seeking counsel, nor as a courtier bringing news, but as a boy who remembered her as both myth and truth. His childhood had been marked by his father's execution, by the silence that followed, by the long shadow of a queen who could not forget a rebellion born of disappointment. But his grandmother, his Lettice, had been a constant. He would find her in the library, beside the fire, always upright, always dignified, reading some volume of prayer or writing long letters to women who had once served her household. She no longer paid attention to politics, but she still knew names, and she asked after them, is Lord Cecil still as proud? Is Lady Scrope still pretending she can sing? And her grandson would smile. Because even now, even as age turned her to legend, her wit remained sharp as a blade. She did not tell him stories of the past, not directly. She never recited the day she married Robert Dudley, nor the look on Elizabeth's face when the truth was discovered. She did not speak of the moment her son was taken to the Tower, or how her knees buckled when she heard the axe fall. But the stories lived in her silences, in the way her fingers sometimes paused mid-sentence, in the way her eyes would go still when someone mentioned Kenilworth, in the way she always kept a small portrait of Lord Denbigh, her son with Dudley, who had died before he could become anything more than a child. It was through her silence that Essex came to know her story, and through her presence, he learned how to carry it. He had his own battles. Of course, the court of James Stuart was not the court of Elizabeth Tudor, but it had its own dangers, sycophants, spies, whispered feuds dressed as flattery. Yet, unlike his father, this Earl of Essex had learned not to demand glory, but to preserve dignity. He did not rebel. He did not beg. He listened. He watched. And in that patience, he carried not only his own future, but the redemption of a family name once burned into the scaffold at Tyburn. And Lettice saw that. She saw that he would survive. And perhaps, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to rest. By now, the house had grown quieter. Many of her oldest servants had died or retired. Her daughters, Penelope and Dorothy, had passed some years earlier, their own stories ending, not with scandal, but with quiet sorrow. There were fewer footsteps in the hall, fewer visitors at the door, and Lettice, wrapped in wool rather than velvet, sat longer each day without speaking. But she was not forgotten. The villagers still bowed their heads when her name was mentioned. They still referred to her as the Countess, as if the Queen herself had never dared strip her of the title. And though her name no longer appeared in court dispatches or royal proclamations, it was etched in the memory of the people, the woman who had outlived a dynasty. She spent most mornings at her window. From there, she could see the gardens, the frost thick along the hedges, The old stone fountain still cracked from a hard winter 30 years before. She liked to watch the sky shift, the way the birds moved from one bare tree to another. When her maid offered to read her scripture, she would nod, but more often, she would close her eyes and listen not to the voice, but to the memory of voices now gone. Sometimes, she dreamed, and in those dreams, they came back. Dudley, standing in the hall at Wanstead, his eyes soft, his voice lower than the court ever heard it. Her son, Robin, riding toward her, with that same reckless smile he had as a boy. Even Elizabeth not in her royal gowns, not in her armor or her crown, but in a simple dress, hair loose, as she had been in the days before they were enemies. And in those dreams, they did not argue, they did not accuse, they only stood and watched her. On Christmas Eve, in the year 1634, Lettice asked for a shawl. She wanted to sit by the fire one last time. Her breathing had grown shallow, her body weak, but her eyes still. Those amber-brown eyes that had once captivated kings were clear. She sat in her chair. She asked for quiet, and when the wind rose outside, and the fire cracked low in the hearth, she closed her eyes and let go. She died not in disgrace, but in peace, not in exile, but in memory, not as the woman who defied the queen, but as the woman who survived her. And when they laid her to rest, it was not in some forgotten village chapel, nor in a quiet family plot. They took her as she had always wanted to the collegiate church of St. Mary, in Warwick, to lie beside Robert Dudley, her second husband. They placed her there, opposite the tomb of her son, the child she had once called her little joy, her sweet Robin, and between them, she found her rest. No royal decree had ever restored her. No public apology had ever been made. But history, stubborn and slow, had remembered her story, though silenced, and had survived. Her name, though cursed, had endured, and her grandson, the third Earl of Essex, carried her legacy not as shame, but as a crown. And yet, in the last quiet of her days, Lettice Knollys had become something the crowned never quite managed to be. She had become whole. There were moments, in the hush before dawn, when the world stood still just long enough for memory to surface. In the final winters of her life, Lettice would sometimes rise before the sun, wrap herself in wool against the chill, and sit by the lead-glass window overlooking the frost-laced hedges of Drayton Bassett. There, as the horizon paled, she would remember not the wars or the banishments or the lawsuits, but the smaller things, the scent of orange blossom at Wanstead, the sound of her son's laughter echoing through the corridors, the press of Dudley's hand when no one was watching. History remembered her as a rebel, a thief of affection, a woman who dared to love a man that the Queen herself could never fully possess. But that story, the one written in court gossip and official silence, had always been told by people who saw only the beginning of her scandal, not the end of her endurance. The truth was softer than that. She had not married Robert Dudley to wound Elizabeth. She had not raised her son to rebel. She had not fought over castles to claim power. She had only wanted to keep what she had earned a husband's hand. À son inheritance. A name not smeared by other people's regret. And when those things were taken from her, she had chosen not vengeance, not violence, but persistence. Where others would have disappeared into shame, she remained. Where others would have lashed out, she had written. Where others would have begged, she had waited. 17 years she lived in silence from her queen. 2 husbands buried, 4 children lost, a house reduced to quiet echoes. But she never once asked to be pitied. She never once demanded to be restored. What she wanted was something far more difficult to be remembered fairly. And by the end, she was. The villagers spoke of her as the countess who walked among them, who paid her staff in coin and respect. Her servants, even in her final days, remarked not on her pride, but her restraint, her unwillingness to speak ill, even of those who had wronged her most. Her grandson spoke of her as the only true constant in a life shattered by legacy, and even her enemies, though long gone, could not erase the fact that she had survived them. When her name appeared in records and wills, in lawsuits, in letters, it came, not with the sting of gossip, but the weight of history, because Lettice Knollys had done something rare in her age. And in any age, she had lived without vengeance. She had been erased and chosen not to erase in return. She had been cast out and never once cursed the gate that closed behind her. Instead, she had turned inward, not in bitterness, but in purpose. She had gathered the tattered edges of a ruined reputation, and she had stitched them slowly, painfully, into something resembling peace. And more than peace, kindness. To the young girl who wanted to become a nun, she offered guidance, not scorn. To her servants, she offered protection, not punishment. To the memory of a queen who had once loved the same man, she offered no poison, no mémoire, no reckoning, only silence, only time, only the grace of letting some wounds go unnamed. They say that in the final weeks, she did not complain of pain, that she kept her household small, her days quiet, her prayers simple, that when her grandson came to visit, she would smile and hold his hand, but speak little, that when the fire burned low in the evenings, she would stare into it, not with fear, but with recognition, as if she had always known that her life would end in flame, not in scandal. And when the end did come on Christmas morning, in the year 1634, there was no fanfare, no cannon fire, no morning bell from the palace, only the hush of snow gathering in the corners of the window-sill, and the soft sound of breath growing still. She died in her chair, not in disgrace, not in exile, but at home. She was more than 90 years old, a lifespan rare even for queens. And in that last moment, she was not Lettice the traitor, not the she-wolf of Wanstead, not the thief of the queen's man. She was only this: a mother, a widow, a grandmother, a woman who had lived long enough to see her enemies buried, and her name, at last, left standing. They buried her beside Robert Dudley, in the Beauchamp Chapel of the Collegiate Church of St. Mary in Warwick. Her tomb was not ostentatious, her effigy modest, but across the aisle, buried under the same stone vault, and lay the small body of Lord Denby, the child she had once held in trembling arms, the child who had died too young to know how many years his mother would carry his name. It is said that when the light filters through the chapel's windows on winter mornings, the rays fall directly upon her effigy's face, and in that light, she does not look bitter. She does not look broken. She looks calm, the kind of calm that only comes after a storm no longer needs to be weathered. And that is how we should remember her. Not as the queen who never wore a crown, but as the woman who, when stripped of everything, still chose dignity, still chose memory, still chose kindness.